Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm continuing my series about the Third Reich, that's Nazi Germany, for A-level. So there'll be a number of issues I'll be examining in this video and subsequent ones, such as how popular National Socialism was, how effectively Hitler established Nazi authority, and to what extent the Nazis transformed German society. We'll look at the aims of the National Socialists, that's the Nazis, their admission to power, their consolidation of power once they were in government, and how they established a police state. We'll look at Adolf Hitler's personality and his methods of control, how he established the Hitler myth about himself, the impact of the Second World War on the regime's popularity, and how much resistance there was to Nazism. We shall examine techniques of propaganda, the changes wrought in society, the racist nostra promulgated by the Third Reich, particularly anti-Semitism. We shall examine the Nuremberg laws, we shall look at Kristallnacht, and the decision to implement the final solution, which is the Holocaust. So one can't look at Germany subsequent to 1933 without having examined it prior to 1933. I don't want to go too far into the background, but anyway, we must know what the immediate context was. In November 1918, the First World War had come to an end with the armistice. So Germany had been obliged to sue for peace. And the armistice was a cessation of hostilities whilst the permanent peace was negotiated, and that was agreed in June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles. So some Germans did not accept that their armed forces had been defeated. However, most of them did. But there was a lot of selective amnesia on this one. In January 1919, an election was held in Germany, and 85% of people voted for parties that were in favour of the armistice, only 15% for parties that wanted to fight on. Now, after the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June 1919, there were those who said, oh no, I always believed in fighting on, and we weren't defeated, and if we'd carried on, we would have won in the end. So some people changed their tune once it was safe to do so because the war was over. But the suffering was so horrific, the military situation was so bleak, that a high majority of people did want to throw in the towel in 1918. So many Germans held their army in extremely high esteem, including some of those who'd said, yeah, we should sign the armistice in 1918. The notion that the German military had been vanquished was inadmissible to many Germans, particularly those of a rightist bent. So some Germans were of the view that a cowardly and greedy left-wing clique, particularly Jewish politicians, had sued for peace so they could gain power, which is largely bogus. Now, it is true that socialists came to office in Germany just as Germany was about to sign the armistice, and they'd never been able to get into government beforehand. It was partly a right-wing way of giving the leftists the responsibility for something that the leftists didn't do. They largely didn't want war in 1914. They'd wanted to make peace in 1916, negotiate the war to come to an end as a draw. In 1917, they said, let's make peace on any terms. The Reichstag had voted for that. So General Ludendorff said about the left-wingers, let them eat the soup that they have prepared for us, because Ludendorff and other generals refused to accept that they had lost the war, their failures in command, and they wanted to pass the buck to socialists who were often from working-class backgrounds. Soon after the war, Ludendorff was having dinner with a British general, and the British general heard Ludendorff's view and said, you mean you've been stabbed in the back? Ludendorff liked that phrase, and he began to disseminate this. That was the version of events that Ludendorff and those of his ilk, those of a right-wing and conservative worldview, disseminated. Anyway, it exonerated him. Now, it's not really failure of the German army officers that much. It's partly just they were outnumbered and outproduced by the Allies who had more factories. So the national mood in the 1920s is one of humiliation and bitterness. People felt very rancorous about the suffering of the war, and suffering continued afterwards. So the Kaiser had abdicated, that's given up his throne and renounced it for his heirs and successors, fled to the Netherlands, where he remained till his death in 1941. So Kaiser is the German word for emperor, but even when speaking English, if we're speaking about the German emperor, we tend to say the German word Kaiser. So the Kaiser abdicating had been a precondition for the armistice as demanded by the Allies. A republic was established in Germany known as the Weimar Republic. That wasn't its official name, but it was commonly called that. So the Weimar Republic lasted up until 1933. In those 15 years, the chancellorship, that's prime ministership, changed hands 16 times. The composition of the coalition governments changed even more frequently. Coalition is a government formed by two or more parties. They share office because no one party had enough representatives in the Reichstag, that's the parliament. So no single party could govern on its own. Let me see. So these countries that keep changing leaders are normally going through a crisis. The head of state of the Weimar Republic was a president. People sometimes call him the ersatz emperor, as in he's a deficient replacement for the Kaiser. So there seemed to be a gap in the German psyche. Something had to fill this lacuna, because they're used to having some titanic figure, like a military leader, to rule them, the Kaiser. And who was going to fill the void? Well, eventually Hitler felt that he could. So the political system was democratic, but highly unstable, possibly because it was excessively democratic. Proportional representation was used, as in if your party gets 20% of the votes, it gets 20% of the seats in the Reichstag. There's no first-past-the-post system, as countries such as the United Kingdom and the United States have. So many people, particularly right-wingers, longed for the predictability of former times. When the Kaiser had been there, they thought that sanity would only return if a system of right-wing authoritarianism was restored. If they couldn't have the Kaiser back, they would like the next best thing. And Hitler eventually came to think that was him. So those of a conservative outlook hankered after the restoration of the House of Hohenzollern. That's the Kaiser's family. As we know, that didn't happen. So the Weimar Republic faced threats both from the extreme left and the extreme right, attempting to overthrow it. So the Weimar Republic was dominated, certainly in the early years, by the SPD, Socialists. SPD, roughly equivalent of the British Labour Party. So the Weimar Republic had inherited something terrible, defeat. It was tarred with that. And the politicians who formed Weimar were from the SPD, the DDP, that's the German Democratic Party, the Centre Party, which was a party for Catholics and so on. And these were people who'd been more moderate on the war, who'd been not quite so bellicose as some of the others, and had wanted to make peace earlier. And so they seemed to be blamed for defeat, which they didn't really cause. So it's unfair, but that's politics. So rightist detractors called the people who founded the Weimar Republic November criminals, as in the armistice signed in November 1918. Well, the mud stuck. And likewise, the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, was signed under the threat of immediate war. This was duress. So some people say, well, it's not valid because we're only signing more or less with a gun to our head. So there were severe restrictions on the German military, the loss of territory, 13% of Germany's pre-war land area. The principle of paying the Allies for the damage caused was accepted. The actual figure was not arrived at until 1921. And in 1921, despite being beset by severe economic woes, Germany had to start coughing up £6.6 billion sterling. So Germany suffered various indignities, such as the Ruhr area being occupied by France in 1923, when Germany failed to keep up with its reparations payments. Germany had to scrap one currency and replace it with another because of hyperinflation. The Saarland, an area in the very west of Germany, was ceded to France for 15 years. At the end of that time, it was to hold a plebiscite, a vote. Do you want to remain part of France or rejoin Germany? Well, I'll tell you the results of that later. And the Saarland was very rich in coal. Coal was a crucial natural resource back then. I know it's not very important now, but coal was used for domestic heating, to make trains run, factories are powered by coal, coal-powered power stations much more than now, and even a few ships were still using coal rather than oil. Anyway, through the 1920s, the Weimar Republic grew more stable and the economy returned to health. Germany's international reputation was rehabilitated, so unemployment fell as prosperity picked up. So it seemed that the Weimar Republic might actually turn out to be a success. However, the unemployment figure was stubbornly high. It never fell below 10%. Then in 1929, the Wall Street crash occurred in New York City, and that caused ripples throughout the global economy, and it severely impacted Germany. Germany was very dependent on American loans. This acute hardship that followed is called the Great Depression. And so Germany was more severely affected than most other Western nations. So 1929 to 1923 was a time of immiseration for the German people as they suffered severe economic hardship, mass unemployment, rising to almost 30%. Those in work often had their salaries cut or their hours cut, and even those with jobs were fearful they may one day lose their jobs and were setting aside money for that eventuality or giving money to their penurious friends and relations. So Germany had lurched from crisis to crisis, and many people had lost faith in democracy by 1933.